The Odyssey, the new movie by Christopher Nolan.
My dad is coming home.
Let's go!
The Odyssey, the ancient Greek epic by Homer. Andramoyenne pe musa, polytropon, hos malapola blankte epe troyes hieron ptoliet ronepersen. Rendering that ancient epic into something like a 2 or 3 hour film, that's honestly a pretty epic task, I think. And I wanted to just share a thought I had, since there's been some discussion and controversy about the movie in a lot of areas, and one of them happens to be about how the characters seem to be speaking from the trailer.
I think it's asleep.
Now, I can't say much about the whole movie, but we just have these little bits of dialogue. One notion that's been put out there is about, well, you know, these kinds of sword and sandal movies, as they're sometimes called, movies about ancient epics or ancient topics from ancient Greece or Rome, etc. Often they have sort of a traditional British theatrical way of the characters have of speaking, right?
And what would you believe?
They fought for you.
How will the world speak my name in years to come? Will I be known as the philosopher, the warrior, the tyrant?
Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's stylistically something that a lot of us are used to. Good or bad, it's worth discussing. It's worth asking about. It's certainly something that we're used to hearing, even in something like Gladiator, for example. When it comes to this text, this is peculiar, and not simply because it's mythological, but really because of the text itself. One notion is that, well, when this poem was heard, the people hearing it would have heard it very much as their own language, so we should have the characters in a modern movie speak more or less like modern people. And while it's potentially a good idea, not a bad idea necessarily, to have characters in your movie be totally comprehensible and viscerally understandable and not necessarily part of a style that we're used to in these types of movies, maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I'm going to kind of leave that out there. But what's interesting is that's really not what these epics are like in ancient Greek. When it comes to the language, so the Odyssey and the Iliad, we can trace them in more or less the form that we have of them, their completed form of these texts, to perhaps the mid-8th or mid-7th century BC, somewhere around there. And what's so interesting is when they were written down, they were already incredibly archaic and probably rather foreign in a lot of ways to the people who then would read them aloud, or even memorize them to perform them. Rhapsodes, that's what they would do. And why is that? Well, that's because the language that Homer is using, well, see, we don't really know. There's this Homeric question with a capital Q. Who was Homer, and did he really exist? Was this blind guy who just received the oral tradition? Let's take it for granted that that's the case. We are definitely certain that this text is from some kind of an oral tradition. It probably goes back at least a few centuries from when it was written down. And assuming it was some guy named Homer, some blind guy, as he's reported to be by some ancient historians, to have been, let's take that all for granted. That means that this poem, what we can see in it is all kinds of intermixing of things from different dialects, not one dialect. So here is one version of interpreting what we have into a just possible, assumed and hypothetical sequence of events. There may have been some kind of war that we know now mythologically as the Trojan War. It may have been a real one between some city, something like Troy or Ilium, and between Greeks or Achaeans, perhaps people from what we consider to be more or less mainland Greece today, or other Greek-speaking places in that period of antiquity, maybe towards the end of the Bronze Age, so in 12th century BC, something like that, before the Dark Ages, the Greek or classical Dark Ages occurred. Not the Middle Ages, Dark Ages that we talk about much more often when it comes to Western European history, but the Dark Ages that go from roughly 1200 BC to 800 BC in the Aegean. So what let's assume, just throw this out there, that there was some kind of real set of events that was similar to the Trojan War as told about by Homer, in the Iliad and talked about as well as the Odyssey. Let's assume that happened. And then, anyway, that there were characters, maybe even someone like Odysseus and others like Agamemnon and Paris, etc. And whatever the reality of that was, that inspired the beginning of songs, tales that were sung about the events, embellished, changed, mythologized by those singers. And these stories, maybe they're just in parts, maybe they start to get assembled and kind of start to come together. Kind of reminds me of planetary formation, where you have like the asteroids, these little pieces of dust and rock coming together and eventually becoming a whole planet. It's something kind of like that. It seems a little bit something like that to me. And this is just, again, one hypothesis about the creation of these epics. At some point, probably pretty early, the dactylic hexameter rhythm, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, with the potential of replacing the long, short, short, dactyl, long, short, short, with long, long, spondees, long, 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 long. So you could have long, short, short, long, 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 short, short, long, all those kinds of variations are possible. So somewhere along the way, that rhythm got into these songs, into these meters, and they were probably increased and grown. And they actually almost certainly remembered the whole thing eventually at some point. And then, assuming Homer was the one receiving it, maybe he added to it, embellished it. He almost certainly, if he was a guy in the 7th or 8th century BC, didn't write it all on his own, because the linguistic evidence is filled with the evidence of other islands' dialects, other places in the Aegean. So while a lot of it is Ionic, there are bits of it that are Aeolic, so you have these other weird things that are mixed in, and a number of other features that are just plain archaic and that you really don't find in other dialects of the language in even the pre-classical period, to say nothing of the classical period and after that. Classical period in ancient Greece is considered to be from the 5th to the 4th century BC. So if we take the Iliad and Odyssey as a whole, we know that they exist in their totality somewhere in the mid-8th to mid-7th century BC. That's when they were written down. That's when they became whole things. And at that point, they were already highly archaic and filled with all sorts of strange things that really are holdovers, as I've talked about in other videos, from the language when it was either in different dialects, where there are even different vowel lengths, different ways of pronouncing words, and different kinds of vocabulary. Things that remain in ancient Greek poetry, even of classical and post-classical periods, only because they were found in epic, that are totally different from the way that normal people were already speaking. And then in the classical period, when it became so popular to recite the Homeric epics and listen to them and listen to the performances from the rhapsodes, this was the classical period in, say, Athens, 5th century BC, 4th century BC. What happens at that point is Athens ascends in its prestige and its importance in the Greek-speaking world. As a result, already by the late 5th century BC and then going into the 4th century BC, the prestige dialect is that of the Athenians. And it's no longer that of Ionic, which is just the latest version of the archaic Ionic, which Homer's epics mostly are, though they're mixed with other things too. From there, the early Koine literature and the way that people just learn Greek as a language is mostly based on Attic. So we have a pretty standardized form of the language that comes into being really around the end of the 5th century BC, early 4th century BC. And most of the ancient Greek prose we have is very consistently in the same dialect. So we can talk about classical Attic and Koine as really being about the same language with very few variations depending on the century or the author that we're talking about. So whether we want to think about people living much later in the Roman Koine period or earlier in classical Athens, the language of Homer, even though hearing the epics was ubiquitous, an important part of the education of Greeks throughout antiquity, and Romans too, it sounded very archaic and poetic. It had this feeling that was definitely not how people spoke. This is very different from, say, the Aeneid, the Latin epic written by Virgil. While Virgil included a number of things that are definitely poetic and unique to the poetry of Latin, on the whole, it's exactly the same dialect and vocabulary and more or less register as the prose of the time. So now we're talking about the translation or the rendering of the ancient epic into dialogue in a modern movie. Should the way the characters speak be how they speak today? Well, if you want to try to emulate the feeling of what Homer sounded like from the point it was written down through classical and Koine, basically all of antiquity. Keep in mind that the first things ever written down as literature were the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's truly the beginning of Western literature. So if you want to render how that felt to most ancient Greeks into English, we'd probably have to have our characters speaking at the very least in a very Shakespearean or King James Bible way, maybe even like Chaucerian Middle English. It's hard to say because works like those of Shakespeare and of Chaucer were already in a literary period. They're not some kind of tradition of epic oral poetry that then was written down. It's very hard to compare, but as far as the influence on literature, probably Shakespeare would be a good model. As far as the archaic nature of the language, we would probably need something from the later Middle English period. As far as the movie and how it seems to be rendering the dialogue to be rather modern and familiar, not to sound highfalutin or foreign or archaic. I've heard that Christopher Nolan did actually consciously want to go in that direction, to try to give both sides the benefit of the doubt. One good reason is it could make these characters feel more like regular people, more accessible. On the con, it would be that the language in the epics never felt to anybody from, again, the 7th century forward to be something that was normal or common. It always sounded archaic and poetic, peculiar, exquisitely beautiful too. Again, that doesn't mean it's a bad choice for a movie. We'll have to see them. I'm going to wait till I see the movie to pass any more judgment than this. In fact, I don't even regard this as a judgment yet. I'm going to have to see the movie and hear how they talk in the whole thing to see if it's something that works as a whole. I'm also aware that he's fond of the Emily Wilson translation, which came out in 2018, of the Odyssey, and I haven't read it yet. I've read parts of it. But I think I need to read the whole translation that she's written and compare it with the original to really give a fair assessment of that translation. So I won't comment any more than that, except that I am aware that she did employ words that were a little bit closer just to how people normally talk. But when it comes to really understanding and appreciating the Odyssey, it deeply helps to have the capacity to speak the language. And I really feel that way because the ancient Greeks who interacted with, who enjoyed, who memorized these texts, already spoke the language fluently. And if you want to do that, I think you should join us at the Polis in Dallas course. We have a beginner and an intermediate level. I'm teaching the beginners. If you're interested in that, I put some information in the description. Because if we can talk in the way that is represented as normal basic prose that we have from antiquity, from, say, Xenophon, through the New Testament, through Plutarch and Cassius Dio and everyone in between, if we can communicate in that way, that means that we have a baseline of quote-unquote normal or not especially fancy or poetic language, certainly not poetic language that belongs in poetry, so that when we read stuff that is very much the same in Homer, we're like, wow, look at that. That's just the same. But where it's different, which is most of the time, we're like, this is Homeric. This is poetical. This is archaic. And if we were to say, to try to learn ancient Greek just to read the Odyssey, then we would be learning words like ennepe as if it were normal. And a word like that is totally not normal when it comes to basic prose. Beautiful and belongs right where it does in the beginning of the Odyssey. But it's not the way we communicate with one another when we speak in ancient Greek. What do you think? Feel free to leave your comments below. Be civil. Eukumai, I pray. I like healthy discussions, but be kind to each other in the comments and thoughtful and respectful, because obviously there's some controversy about this film. And again, for myself, I would rather reserve my judgments or what I liked or disliked, etc., until after I've seen it, which will be soon enough. So thanks for watching, liking, and sharing, and thanks to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Karin Humin Eko. Eroste.